maybe as a level set for folks, a quick run through the history of MongoDB at a quick pace. So the company started in 2007 in New York. It was named Tengen at the time. Open source in 2008. Dave became CEO in 2014. The company went public on NASDAQ in October of 2017. And I read somewhere that it was the first database company to go public in 26 years. Is that right?
That's correct.
Incredible. And fast forward to today, the company has about 25,000 customers, spanning a wider range of industries in more than 100 countries around the world, so global domination. And the company has also had a particularly impressive ride in public markets under your stewardship. The company went public, I believe, at a 1.2 billion valuation, so back at the end of 2017. And fast forward to today, like not that long after, when I checked earlier today, the company had an 18.2 billion market cap. So incredible, right? And wonderful to see. And congratulations on all of this. So. Look, I think it's always inspiring for folks at this event to hear a little bit about the background of our speakers. You've done some fascinating things through as an entrepreneur, as a CEO, also as a VC, although more briefly. But if you could, give us like a couple of minutes on your story, that'd be awesome.
Sure. My academic training is as an engineer. What I realized about myself was that I really wanted to be at the intersection of business and technology. I didn't want to be stuck behind a computer all day. I felt like I'd be like a caged tiger. And so I really wanted to kind of be at what I felt where the action was, which doesn't mean that what other people are doing is not interesting. That's just what I seem to really get excited about. And I started my career in some big companies. I started off in a management program at AT&T, and I rose pretty quickly, but quickly got frustrated with big company politics. Went to some smaller telecom company, and that's in the 90s when telecom was hot, and VCs were investing in kind of building out the broadband internet. And all of a sudden, I saw these companies get funded. I was advising some of the companies who were trying to sell to me, and then they got bought by people like Cisco, and they seemed to be having a lot of fun and doing well. And so I said, why don't I do that? And so I started my first company in 98. It was a first generation cloud computing company. Actually, it was a company called Applica, which got merged with another company called Breakaway. And we actually competed with Loud Cloud, which was Mark and Ben's company. And that company ended up hitting a wall because 70% of our customers were .coms when the bubble burst in 2000 and the venture capital dried up. But we actually had a real business. It's just that our customer diversity wasn't as good as it should have been. And that was the inspiration to start Blade Logic, which I started in 2001, which was essentially you were building a data center automation platform to help people provision, configure, and manage service in the data center. Because as people moved to these kind of distributed architectures, all the complexity was at the back end. And
pretty crazy time, by the way, to start in 2001.
Yes, I raised my first round of financing 5 days before 9/11. And then obviously capital was super expensive. So we only raised 29 million total and had 7 million in the bank when we filed to go public. We went public in 2007. And so you really build a lot of muscles in terms of the cheapest form of financing is revenue, right? Getting revenue from your customers. And so we really financed the business through customers. And we ended up going public in 2007. And then a year later, we just got an offer to get bought out by BMC. At the time, it was a pretty high multiple. Obviously, it seems paltry in today's revenue multiples, but it was a pretty rich multiple for that era. And we decided to sell. I ended up becoming the president of BMC for a couple of years. Then I took some time off, and you were hinting at this. And then I became a VC for a while, and spent some time on the West Coast with Greylock, and then on the East Coast with OpenView, and actually I led the B round at Datadog. So 2014 turned out to be a pretty interesting year for me. I led the B round in Datadog, and then literally 6 months later, I joined MongoDB as CEO. So it was an interesting time for me. I still stayed on the Datadog board, and I'm actually on the board today. Obviously, it's been a pleasure to work with Ali and the team there. They've done a fantastic job. And I also felt like I could add some value to MongoDB. And so we're fortunate. The business was roughly about 250 people, trailing about 30 plus million in revenue. And today we're approaching 4,000 people and about $700 million in run rate.
Yeah. And, like obviously, I mean, this is a global event, and both Mongo and Datadog are global companies. But it's also Data Driven NYC, and like just like for folks to like fully realize this, I mean, there are basically two major successes of enterprise tech in New York, at least over the last few years, and that's Mongo and Datadog, and you're CEO of one and board member at the other. So like your impact has been just insane, right, on this ecosystem. So.
Well, thank you, Matt. By the way, I should tell people, I don't know if people realize this, but UiPath is pricing tonight and starting to trade tomorrow. So we'll have a third big, and their valuation, I think, will be quite large. So there'll be another big data-driven tech company in New York. So it speaks well to New York. And I think New York is turning out to be a pretty interesting place for tech. Yeah.
Actually, on that note, like any, building BladeLogic was based in Massachusetts. Mongo has been being built in New York, at least originally, even though I think you had also a co-headquarters like on the West Coast. Like any thoughts on the ecosystem and building enterprise software out of the East Coast?
So one, I personally love New York City. It's my favorite city in the world, and I've been to almost every major city in the world. So I'm thrilled to see. When I started BladeLogic, I actually wanted to build it in New York City, but at the time, it was very hard to recruit people who were willing to, you're trying to recruit from, the big banks and so forth. And there are people who really, wanted to kind of maintain their cash comp, but then also have big equity. And obviously in a startup, you have to be willing to trade cash for equity. So culturally, there wasn't as many people who had that entrepreneurial mindset. There was obviously some interesting companies. Obviously, DoubleClick was doing well, and ad tech was a big space, and new media was another hot area. But hardcore tech was not a place for New York. I think what's changed is one is the access to capital. Obviously, firms like FirstMark and others have done a lot of investing in New York, so it's actually encouraged entrepreneurs to keep companies in New York. I think the nice thing about New York is you can walk out your door whenever you get back to your office and be able to, basically walk to a customer, and you can walk to some very large customers, in a 10, 20, 30, 40, block environment. So, and then flying anywhere from New York is so easy. Like, flying to Europe is like flying to the West Coast. Even flying to like Israel is easier than from the West Coast, and going to Asia is not that much longer. It's only maybe a couple hours longer. So access to the world from New York is very easy. And I like the heterogeneity of the culture. It's not all tech all the time. In the Valley, you go to a soccer game and you just run into VCs and entrepreneurs and engineers, and it just gets a little bit monotonous, where I think the cultural diversity of New York is something that I really appreciate. And you see people from all walks of life. So I would say one of the challenges in New York, though, and I think it's changing now with the success of all these companies, is hiring senior level talent. You can hire great engineers, but hiring a great CFO or a great head of sales, because there hasn't been this generational set of companies in New York where people have, built their, developed their skills and built their experience in the New York City. So in the early days when I joined, actually my first CRO, my first CMO were actually on the West Coast, because I couldn't find enough depth and experience in New York City. I think as you see the success of these companies, Datadog, MongoDB, potentially UiPath and others, I think you're going to see more talent in the local area. And I think that bodes well for, the New York and generally the East Coast. But that would say it was probably the only challenge. But we obviously were collaborative pre-COVID, and figured out how to work. In fact, my predecessor at MongoDB was actually based out of California, and so there was a kind of a dual headquarter. But very quickly we moved the center of gravity to New York, and that served us well. But obviously with COVID, we've learned to collaborate, and now we have a very distributed team. I have a CTO in Seattle, I have a head of sales in Europe, I have a GC in California. And our philosophy, let's hire the best talent no matter where they are, within reason. Obviously, we're not going to hire someone in some island in the South Pacific, but within reason that we can make work, and that allows us to just kind of really build the best team possible.
Great. All right, I'd love to chat about product, and in particular Atlas, which has been this incredible success story. So Atlas, which is your database as a service offering, was launched in late 2016. So at the time representing by definition 0% of revenue. And then it progressed to representing 23% of revenues in fiscal year 2019, 39% in 2020, and now 46% in 2021. So it's gone from 0 to being almost half of the company's revenue. I just think it's absolutely fascinating and super impressive. So maybe as a level set, what does Atlas do so folks can wrap their minds around it?
Sure. What Atlas essentially allows people to do is consume MongoDB as a service, as a managed offering delivered from the cloud, and we run on all the 3 major cloud providers. And you pay as you go. So you can start the cheapest paid tier is like $9 a month. So it's literally like having 2 cups of coffee a month. We have customers now spending more than 7 figures with us on Atlas. So depending on how big your deployment is, how much resources you need. And it really ranges the gamut in terms of a variety of customers. I would say there's 2 big reasons why customers love Atlas, and one big reason why it really helps MongoDB. So the 2 big reasons why it helps customers is, one is it just makes it that much easy to consume MongoDB, because MongoDB has had a very strong product market fit. And one of the other things customers care a lot about is getting rid of undifferentiated heavy lifting, right? And managing a distributed database can be quite challenging. And so when they basically say, why don't you, the experts, manage it for us, it just alleviates them. And a customer will always tell us, my competitive advantage is not by hiring more DBAs and more support staff. My competitive advantage is by building great product, adding new features, shipping features more quickly, seizing new opportunities, and responding to new threats, really fast. And investing more and more time and money and resources and maintaining and managing my data persistent architecture doesn't make a lot of sense, when I look at it from a strategic point of view. Now, obviously, that's at the senior level. Maybe the ops people may feel a little threatened, but they've also realized that they can add more value to the organization without having to day-to-day manage MongoDB. What's good for us as a company is that previous to Atlas, we had our free version and our paid version. And we had a classic open source problem where you have to figure out where the paywall is, right? So if you constrain the paywall too much, then you have very little adoption. And if you give away too much of your product, it's very hard to monetize. So you're always trying to find that fine balance in terms of what the paywall is. Well, with a service, with open source as a service, you can monetize everything because you're just paying as you go. So it allowed us to really capture value, but still also give compelling value to our customers, and which is why it grew so quickly. So it went from 0 to a $350 million run rate business, when we announced our last quarter's earnings. So then it's growing at about a 66% annualized growth rate right now.
Remarkable. And then you keep adding more stuff to it, like more features, more like product expansion. So data lake, search, online archive, and Realm, which was an acquisition, I believe. Do you want to talk about the product expansion thinking?
Yeah, it really comes from a lot of customer feedback and our intuition about the market. So, you mentioned a bunch of products. So search is basically what we found. A lot of customers were dual homing data to both MongoDB and, say, Elastic. And they said, this is crazy. We don't want to do that. And they said, we really want to, embed all, our OLTP functionality along with application search in one platform. It's much easier to maintain. We don't have to manage 2 systems, learn 2 platforms, blah, blah, blah. And so we've now embedded that. It just makes life so much easier for customers. And Elastic themselves are going more towards the security space than application search. The second area around Realm.
Search your S3 folders and that.
It's more of like application search logic. So if you're like, so every app has some search functionality. So embedding that, more tightly into the app is helpful for the application developers. Less systems to maintain. The second thing that we announced was Realm. So we had a lot of customers who obviously are building mobile. And if you think about mobile, everyone's going with a mobile first strategy, especially with the advent of 5G, when network speeds will be 100 times faster, at least we hope, than what we get with LTE or 4G. And so I think the line of the distinction between mobile and web apps will blur when you have that kind of network performance. And so then the challenge becomes, if I'm going to have a lot more data at the edge, how do I manage that data? So people want a very easy to use mobile database. And there's a lot of very little innovation in the mobile client. So Realm had gotten a lot of traction, but they also, need to synchronize data from the edge to the core. So being able to do that, was very challenging because with mobile, you have, online and offline connectivity, and you need to be able to still use the app, but then synchronize when you get back online. And conversely, you need to kind of get updates from the backend server. And that's a pretty difficult challenge for developers. And so we've automated that for developers, made it really easy. And we think that that'll make MongoDB even a more compelling platform to use. And then online archive, it sounds actually oxymoronic, but essentially what we do is say you can still archive your data, but you can still appear like you can still query the data. So as data volumes grow, you don't need to keep all the data online. You can shunt it off to like S3, to your S3 buckets, but still query it very easily. And so you get all the benefits of a much more efficient storage architecture, but still be able to query the data as you want. And there'll be more things coming. So essentially what we're trying to do, Matt, is just allow customers to do more things with MongoDB. So it really becomes an application data platform versus just a database.
Okay, thank you. And data lakes is part of this as well, right?
Correct. So we're enabling people to use the power of our query language to query data, not just from MongoDB, but from other sources. And it's not necessarily we're not trying to be a data warehouse. We're not trying to compete with a Snowflake. It's more to help developers, because we believe that applications of the future, even today, are more and more instrumenting the business. So applications are now embedding analytics, especially real-time analytics, into apps. Think about like a leaderboard for a gaming application. Think about financial app, think about supply chain apps where you have to have real-time, information. So being able to embed analytics is going to be even important. And our focus is really helping developers use data to build amazing applications.
Is there stuff on the product roadmap that you can talk about?
Yeah, I would just think of us as, we really want to be an application data platform. So a lot of people sometimes confuse us. Are you competing with Snowflake? Are you going after Databricks, or Dremio or other companies like that? And our focus is only predominantly, I should say, around the developer. If you read Snowflake's S1, they never mention the word developer. That's always about the business analysts, the data scientists, et cetera, to help them kind of get, insight into the data. We're really focused on helping developers build amazing applications and leveraging software and data to do so. So you'll see us expand into, other capabilities that developers need to kind of build applications.
So speaking of developers, and you mentioned open source earlier, I'd like to switch tags and talk specifically about open source, especially in 2021, as there's been so much evolution. What's been really interesting when I was researching this and ahead of this talk, I hadn't realized to which extent the MongoDB open source project has continued to just explode in popularity. What are the key drivers behind that? Why do you think it continues to be so incredibly popular and in fact accelerating?
Well, I think the first thing is one, you got to have strong product market fit. And what essentially MongoDB did was address two fundamental problems with the relational database. One, the relational database, where you're trying to basically disaggregate data into rows and columns, is a very counterintuitive way to model data. It's not aligned to how developers work. And as the data model grows, it becomes more and more brittle and it's harder to change. Talk to anyone who wants to do a schema change and they'll roll their eyes because they know how painful that is. Well, we essentially solved that problem by coming out with our document architecture, which is much more conducive to the way developers think and the way developers code. So it just makes it so much easier to use MongoDB to build applications, to do it quickly and to do it more powerfully. The second big challenge with relational databases that are not designed for scale. Oracle was founded in 1977. We're talking about a company that's now 44 years old, and they still haven't solved the scalability problem. They've had Oracle RAC, Sitecard, and other ways to try and replicate data. They're super expensive because the relational database was designed to be a single node system. So as data volumes grow, their architecture has limitations. Now, Amazon's tried to make some extensions to, with Aurora to kind of make relational database suck less, but they fundamentally have scalability problems. And that's MongoDB is designed from the ground up to be highly scalable. We have replication and sharding built into our architecture, so you can scale very, very easily using MongoDB. So that's why we've gotten so much popularity, and that's what we've taken up. So one is, I think, one is linking to product market fit. The second thing I would say is that we didn't view open source as a crowdsourced R&D strategy. We use open source as a freemium strategy to kind of let people, use MongoDB, quickly kind of play with it, tell their friends, and leverage the virality of the open source community, to build a community of people who wanted to just try and use MongoDB. So today, MongoDB, to your point, is everywhere. Literally, there's not one country, one city in the world that I don't think someone's not using MongoDB. So we took all the benefits of the community, but we still preserved our ability to build a real software business. And that was important to us. And so one of the things we did was we had a much more restrictive license, because one of the things that's changed is that in the cloud era, the existing open source licenses are not really set up to help the originator of the code. In fact, I would argue, for example, that AWS has done a better job monetizing MySQL than MySQL, Sun, or Oracle ever did, right? And so what the cloud providers are doing is taking these free versions of open source, plugging it into their platform, and monetizing it. And then, as you know, there's been a lot of friction between AWS and Elastic and other open source companies. We didn't want to go down that path. We said, you know what? We invest a lot in the product. In fact, we've invested over $700 million in R&D since we started the company, and more than 50% of that goes into the free product. We think it would be very unfair for someone to just take a free version, make money off it, and not give anything back. So we have constraints in terms of what you could, in terms of offering MongoDB as a service. We still believe on all the tenets of open source, and it's worked out well. So it's allowed us to build a real business. It's allowed us to invest back into the product, so our community benefits from the continued innovations in the product, and and obviously our investors also see a return on the investment.
Yeah, and for the sort of open source geeks out there, that was the evolution from a license known as AGPL to SSPL, right? That's something that you guys created, right? Like that.
Yes, so we came with SSPL. It was fairly controversial. It was a lot of worries, like, oh my God, adoption. The people say you're not open source anymore. No one's going to use your product. But what people forget is that the first thing people don't say is it open source or not. They say, does this technology solve my problem? And we knew that we solved a very important problem. Then we said a developer in New York City, a developer in Silicon Valley, or a developer in Shanghai or Mumbai is not going to care, wow, is this an OSI approved license? They say, is it free? Can I modify the source code? Is it free to distribute? And all those tenets still apply. It's just that if you want to offer a MongoDB as a service, you have to open source all the extensions of MongoDB and the underlying management plane. So it's a very fair trade. And just to make that point, for the fourth year in a row in the Stack Overflow service, we were voted the most wanted database by developers on a worldwide basis. And what we also saw was that last year we had more downloads of our software than in the first 10 years of the company's history. So we have never been more popular than we are today.
Amazing. So if part of the evolution of the license was to sort of clarify the relationship with the cloud vendors, how do you work with cloud vendors these days? Like what can they do? How do you cooperate or partner with them?
So obviously with Atlas, it has to be deployed and delivered to the cloud. So we have to work with the cloud providers. In fact, the cloud providers help subsidize the R&D effort to deploy Atlas on the cloud platforms, because remember, they're the beneficiaries of these workloads moving to their platform. Not only do they get, revenue from the underlying consumption of storage and compute and network services, but they see customers, for every dollar they spend on Atlas, they probably spend another $5 to $10 on other ancillary services. So they're motivated to drive, those workloads to their cloud. Now, Amazon and Azure in particular have competitive offerings, but we feel we're very well positioned when it comes to going head to head against those. But there's some spirit of competition. And that's like we've been dealing with the big guys, Oracle from day one, Microsoft, and obviously now Amazon. And that we recognize, the market's large enough and we feel like we're well positioned. And they've actually helped subsidize and drive a lot of marketing, right? They give us marketing dollars to drive customer demand. We partner with them on events. We partner with them on deals. They align the sales compensation to incentivize having their salespeople work with us. So there's a lot of healthy partnership there.
Yeah, and you have a multi-cloud offering now, right? What is
right? So we're the only player company that allows you to run. Well, one, we ran on all three clouds, but before you would run, say, App A on one cloud, and App B on another, and App C on another. Today, with our new announcement, you can run App A across multiple cloud providers. Now, why is that important? Well, if you're a customer in Australia or you're a customer in Canada, Amazon or say Azure may only have one region, and if you want diversity, and you only care about that market because you're a local Australian or Canadian company, the only way you get geodiversity is by going to another cloud provider. And we've seen a lot of high-profile outages, and so they worry about am I going to get the diversity? The second thing is, this market, the database market, has a lot of baggage with Oracle's past behavior. So no one wants to get locked into any one vendor. So especially, say, someone like AWS, who's got very broad ambitions as a company. And so one day you might find AWS competing with you in your core business. And so given that, companies do like the fact that they can leverage MongoDB to run on any cloud provider and leverage the best of breed services, because the cloud providers are competing against each other. So Google may have some capabilities that are better than Amazon, and Amazon may have some capabilities better than Azure, and vice versa. So they can pick and choose which services to use from which cloud providers.
Yeah. And with this whole complexity of open source and cloud vendors, and for anyone that's listening to this, for whom this discussion is not completely clear, the concern all along has been that cloud vendors can just take the open source code and run a competitive version of the product without cooperation from the original vendor. Right? That's the heart of the whole discussion. And for additional context, it's a current controversy around Elastic, who seems to have gotten itself tripped up in this whole conversation. So with this whole complexity of open source and cloud and the relationship, what do you think of I guess open source in 2021 for a young company? If you're a young startup, is that the way to go? Is that or is there an evolution there?
Well, I think you first have to ask yourself, why are you trying to be open source? What's the strategy behind it? You shouldn't just be open source for the sake of being open source. You should just say there's a clear strategy. For example, Snowflake is not an open source company. Datadog is not an open source company, right? So you can thrive as an infrastructure company without being open source. So you have to ask yourself, why is open source an important element of your strategy, and be very, very clear on that. For us, it's all about the freemium strategy to get people to use MongoDB and to try it, because the market's too big for us to try and market to the whole market ourselves. We want to leverage the virality of open source to get broad adoption. So I think that's what. Second thing is you have to recognize that if you're open source, the best way to monetize open source is open source as a service. If that's the case, then how are you going to make sure you have a moat around your product, and that the cloud providers don't come in and take your free version and compete with you? So you have to think through your licensing around how you plan to license your product, and make it simple for customers so that it's not confusing to them or to the market about what your intentions are. And third, it's not trivial to be both building software and running software. So you need to make sure you invest in both, right? There's a lot of companies who try and do that and they struggle. So you have to really build real competence around your tooling and your management infrastructure, your telemetry, or your multi-tenant architecture. All these things matter in terms of building a real cloud service. And so that's something you want to think about. But again, it all depends on what your strategy is. If you're just trying to build a product to just get adoption and you don't really care about monetizing, then open source makes sense, and then you can give it to the community and then use crowdsourced R&D so that the community makes it better over time. If it's so there's many reasons to do open source. Monetization is not the only one.
Mm-hmm. And to that point, and switching a little bit to go-to-market strategy. So you mentioned that you use open source as a freemium strategy. Is that for a company at the global scale of Mongo? Is that still the core motion? Is that sort of bottoms up, or is there also top down of AEs going directly to CIOs? How do those two motions?
So our business starts and stops with developers. If developers don't use our product, we don't have a business. So we have to make sure we drive a lot of developer enthusiasm by using MongoDB. That being said, developers don't necessarily have the right to say yes. They have the right to say no. They can kill a deal by saying, I'll never use MongoDB, and you're done. But just because they like MongoDB doesn't mean that you're going to get a check in the mail from the customer, right? So you have to then translate developer enthusiasm and interest into a real business, value proposition for some decision maker. It's not always a CIO. It could be the, VP of infrastructure. It could be the line of business, depending. And in our business, it's a land expand. So we're not like a Workday or Salesforce where we're making an enterprise-wide decision day one for the whole enterprise to use your platform. We coexist with Oracle, we coexist with Microsoft, we coexist with other players, right? And we want to get that first workload. And we find the relationship is kind of tends to be in three stages. First, you kind of land a workload or a few workloads. Then you find adjacencies to expand into as you see successes. Okay, I should use MongoDB for the next application or re-platform an existing application. And then maybe over time, maybe even years, then all of a sudden say, you know what, we need to make MongoDB a standard. It's all over. Let's make it a standard, and that essentially means that you now have the full organization's endorsement to be, the platform of choice. And typically, we see a lot of consolidation happening now in large companies. They don't want to use a net new database for every net new use case. They want to standardize on, say, a modern standard like MongoDB, maybe a relational standard like Postgres, and then maybe there's some corner cases where they use something esoteric. And our goal is to be the standard where we can go after 80% of the use cases. And that's when you see, the relationship with the customer really grow fast. Sorry, go ahead.
And that's still how it works. I mean, it's fascinating for like all of us who are looking at the similar type of companies getting built, right? There's this tension between like bottoms up and top down. But like at your scale, there is still no sort of like temptation to just say, hey, everybody knows Mongo now. So yes, I mean, it's great to like that developers love us, but like, why not we go directly to the CIO, because the CIO by now knows Mongo, right? So you guys.
Yeah, so I think you have to really understand customer buying behavior, because even the CIO says, I'm going to standardize on MongoDB, they don't have the time or the resources to re-platform every app onto MongoDB. Look at Oracle. Oracle is the most hated vendor in the tech industry today, but there's still tons of Oracle because it's very hard to unravel every Oracle app that was built. So you're still going to see a lot of Oracle out there. So what customers want to focus on is, where am I having the most pain? We tell our salespeople, look for where the pain is in the organization. Either they need to address a pain point through building a new app, or they need to re-platform an existing app because the users are complaining, or they're just not being able to service the business properly. Find where they have the most pain. That typically, the more the pain, the more the dollars are available, and the more attention of senior management. And then we use that as a wedge to get in the door, and then use that as a way to, so once we get in the door, our net expansion rates are very high, because obviously we can then start winning more and more workloads. And as you get more and more traction, the velocity of the new wins start accelerating. So you have to, we encourage our salespeople to go slow to go fast. You don't want to cut too many corners day one. Have some success, build a relationship, get some confidence built around MongoDB, and then go after a new business.
And as a CEO, how do you arbitrage between the different needs? This, even at your scale, there's a finite amount of resources, and like, some of it needs to go into open source to make this like a very popular product, but like some of it needs to go into the commercial product. How do you arbitrage it, and how has it evolved over time?
Yeah, it's a good question. So obviously there's lots of competing interests. So we think a lot, as a high growth company, we think a lot about how quickly we can grow. So we look at we obviously have now a lot of data in terms of productivity of our sales force, what the ramp times are, et cetera. So we think about how quickly can we grow our top line relative to our productivity, and how fast we can hire. That kind of drives our top line forecast. So then our revenue forecast then drives an expense forecast. We make some decisions about, are we going to be profitable, lose a little money, make a little money? Today, we made a decision that we're investing for growth because this market is so big. We only have 1% share. And so it'd be foolish. We have $1 billion, close to $1 billion in the bank. It'd be foolish to try and optimize for profitability. We're investing for growth, but there's obviously some, limit as to how much you can lose. So that creates essentially our expense envelope in terms of how much you want to invest. And then we apportion, we review all the projects and see, get people to rank all the new investments as well as all the existing investments they're doing. And then we triage which ones do we want to invest in new, which projects are going well, which projects should we shut down. So it's there's a little bit of sausage making in the process. Sometimes there's a little bit of blood on the walls. There's a lot of fierce battles about what to do and what not to do. But ultimately, we all kind of use that process to galvanize our priorities and what we're trying to do. And obviously, we also want to plant seeds, especially on the product side, for things that we think will bear fruit 2-3 years from now. Because a lot of the investments we're making now, won't show up as products until later.
So maybe to close, like last 5 minutes or so, I'd like to talk about lessons in scaling. So like you've done it, time and again, and both before IPO and then very spectacularly so after IPO. Maybe talk to teams and hiring and like what do you want to do, before IPO versus IPO. Do you have to recruit a completely different set of folks as you scale, and then what are the right type of folks that you want as a growth stage startup versus as a public company?
Yeah, so I view my job that I need to do 3 things well. I need to be very clear on what our strategy is, at least the next couple of years. I need to make sure I have the right people in the organization, especially the executive team, to go execute on that strategy. And I need to remove any barriers, whether they're cultural barriers, financial barriers, organizational barriers, to make sure people are set up for success. So obviously with our strategy, we're not changing that every day. So once you're clear on the strategy, then a lot of the focus is on people. In fact, sometimes I joke with my chief people officer that I'm like the glorified head of HR, because 80% of the issues I'm dealing with are on people. Who's moving up, who's moving sideways, and sometimes who's moving backwards. And in a high growth business, not everyone scales at the same rate, right? And so, it's not a secret, but since we've gone public 3.5 years ago, we've had 6 C-level changes, right? So essentially almost 2 a year, right? Because certain people hit a wall, and you as a leader need to, one, see when someone is starting to struggle, right? It's almost like watching someone swim and is starting to struggle when they may be starting to keep their head above water. You can start seeing like the decisions they're making, and you see a lot of the signs with their organization. Their organization will start getting frustrated if the executive is not able to scale. And so what you as a leader have to do is this a fixable development issue, or is this a fatal flaw? At some point you have to say, can this be remedied, or do I have to make a change? And too many times people wait too long to make changes. And so at some point, we have to say like, hey, it's time to bring in someone else who can kind of help the organization scale to the next level, and they have the right level. And ideally, I like to promote within, because you have a lot more data around someone who's inside the organization. But obviously you also have to recruit outside for a certain set of skills that you may not have in the organization. So it's tricky, but this is part of leadership, right? And I break it down into kind of 3 things. Like a leader has to essentially recruit well. So that's a good sign about how well they're scaling, about the quality of the team they're recruiting, because it all starts with recruiting. 2, are they developing their teams in a way to get them to kind of really, understand what needs to be done? Is everyone aligned? And 3, are they executing consistently quarter in, quarter out? And do they have an operating rhythm? How do they kind of measure the success of the business? How do they kind of quickly triangulate on issues and resolve them quickly? And so it's a constant kind of focus around those 3 things that allow us to make sure that we're kind of running our business and scaling it well.
Yeah, very interesting. And then to close, and in that same vein, like any advice to founders and CEOs about how they can scale themselves? I guess, how do you scale yourself now? You're running a gigantic company with offices all around the world. I can only imagine how many emails and pings you got, while you were kind of spending time with us. Like, how do you, almost at a personal level, like keep it together and not lose your sanity and make sure that you have time to think?
Well, I think for a CEO, happiness for a CEO is a great relationship with your board, and having a high functioning cohesive team under you, right? So that's the ideal state. In terms of development, I think you bring up a very important point. My philosophy in life has always been, always be the student of the game, not the master of the game. What I mean by that is you constantly have to work at your trade craft. Don't assume that just because you're successful in the past, you can be successful in the future, because your business is changing, your market's changing, your customers are changing, your competition is changing, your organization is changing. And if you just keep trying to run the same playbook, you're going to hit a wall. And the execs who I've seen struggle and not being able to scale are the ones who just can't adapt and grow. So always have the mindset about like, what do I need to, think about like, okay, where will the business not be today, but where will the business be 2-3 years from now? And what are the things that I need to be able to do by that time frame? And what do I have to work on now to make sure I get that kind of outcome? Those are the people who I see tend to really grow and evolve as a leader. And no matter how successful you are, right? Whether you're a multi-time CEO or a first-time founder, or someone who's just become a first-time manager, you got promoted from an individual contributor role to you're a team lead or a manager. You always have the attitude I have more to learn, and that to me has paid massive dividends. And so I'd encourage everyone to take the same approach.
Great. All right, to close, maybe just a couple of questions from the group. A question from Alan about was your strategy always to growing by acquisition and integration versus organically, and how do you think about this? I think
we've made 3 acquisitions, and 2 of them were non-revenue acquisitions. There were more technology acquisitions, and one was Realm, and the other one was WireTiger, which is a storage engine that we bought in early 2015. We made an acquisition of MLab, which is like a first-generation database as a service offering in MongoDB. We bought that just to kind of get some customer momentum around Atlas. So 99% of our growth has been organic, and the market's very big. So we really focused on organic growth versus trying to grow through acquisition.
Great. And then one last question from Julia. How does MongoDB manage to not compete with their open source community?
We don't really see a competition with the community. The community is really, I would say our salespeople sometimes get frustrated because they think the free version competes with us, our paid versions. But we think that that's part of, that's part of open source. The most successful open source companies go after big markets because by definition, you can't monetize all your usage. So you just have to make sure there's enough out there that you can monetize to build a healthy business. So going after the database market is one of the largest markets in enterprise software. And so, as I said, we only have 1% share, and I think we're doing quite well. So imagine if we had 3 or 5% share, we'd be a very, very large company. And so we feel good about the opportunity in front of us. And we also think there'll be a lot of free usage of MongoDB out there.
All right, very good. Well, that feels like a great place to end. This was fascinating. I really appreciate it. I know the community really appreciates it as well. Thanks for everything that you've done for this space and enterprise software and New York, as mentioned at the beginning. And look, we're very excited to see what you guys do next. We're all cheering for Mongo, and what a remarkable success story.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you for having me. And I obviously have to, acknowledge my team. We have a great team, and I'm very fortunate to be able to work with a very talented team and be able to do what we do every day.
Wonderful. Great. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.